After defending his UFC lightweight title for the third time, Dana White stunned the MMA community when he dismissed Islam Makhachev, claiming no one can be the pound-for-pound #1 fighter when Jon Jones is still around.
As long as Jon Jones is still fighting, active, and in the rankings, yeah, nobody's pound-for-pound best fighter in the world.
While some agree with the UFC's president, a lot of people don't.
Best fighter right now, pound for pound? How could you say? How could you say it's Jon Jones? Honestly, how could you say? We're not talking about things that happened in 2011, 2012. We're talking about everything equal, same weight class right now, skill sets, boom. Who matches up and who is, to me, it's Islam or Leon. Really, that's the one I kind of go back and forth. But after Saturday, how is it not Islam?
The big knock people have against Jones is that he isn't anywhere near active enough nowadays. In the past 4 years, he's only fought once, whereas Islam has 8 fights and 8 victories in that same time period. So, was Dana right? Or has Makhachev finally done enough to call himself the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world? At UFC 302, Islam Makhachev put on the performance of a lifetime. It wasn't the dominating victory many predicted, but he had to show something we rarely see in his fights: heart, grit, and battling against adversity.
These guys now really fighting with everything they had, fighting on instinct, skill, technique, heart, dedication, discipline, all the rest of it, whatever you want to call it. These men were in there fighting their goddamn asses off.
And that victory was history-making. Islam now holds the longest win streak in UFC lightweight history, beating out Tony Ferguson and his dear friend Khabib Nurmagomedov.
He has the 3rd longest winning streak in UFC history. That's 14 in a row in one of the best weight classes in the UFC in its prime right now. And so I was a little bit surprised that, Dana White in the post-fight press conference had the stance of like, no, this guy ain't #1, it's Jon Jones.
He is tied first for the most title fight victories in UFC lightweight history, and according to the official UFC rankings, is the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world. But UFC President Dana White doesn't agree with that.
Yeah, I think he's, one of the greatest of all time. I think he's incredible. I don't think he's the pound-for-pound best fighter in the world. For anybody to call Islam the pound-for-pound best fighter in the world when Jon Jones is still fucking fighting is nuts and shouldn't be ranking in the pound-for-pound or doing any of the fucking rankings ever, if that's what you really think. Jon Jones has never lost a fight, ever. He's fought all the baddest dudes in the world. And then when you think about what pound-for-pound rankings really mean, he moved it up to heavyweight and destroyed the best guy in the world. As long as Jon Jones is still fighting, active, and in the rankings, yeah, nobody's pound-for-pound best fighter in the world.
And while both men are 2 of the most successful stars in the entire sport, many MMA fighters go through low moments and use therapists for their mental health. And so can you, thanks to the paid partner of this video, BetterHelp. BetterHelp is a company that offers online therapy. One thing we all deal with in life, MMA fighters included, is loss in one form or another. And like fighters, lots of people are accustomed to holding our feelings inside, portraying this strong image, and not wanting to feel like we're bringing the people around us down.
Just better all over, because and it's been a while because I've been in such a flow. This is like, so far, I feel like this is going into the best years of my life. That's side note, but literally, I feel like I'm rolling into this year. I feel like I'm rolling into the best years of my life.
Maybe not as frequently, but yeah, I think it's important to like open up and talk about how you feel. We're such in the spotlight of being tough guys all the time and stuff, but we're people too. Like that's the part of the mindset. Like Dustin the fighter, but what about Dustin?
For Dustin, therapy guided him through his lowest moments. For GSP, it was anxiety. And for Adesanya, speaking to a therapist helped him become self-aware during difficult situations. So even the toughest, most stoic people we look up to use therapy in their lives. But thanks to BetterHelp, getting in contact with a therapist has never been easier. After answering a few questions from your phone or computer, BetterHelp will get you in touch with one of their credentialed therapists, usually within just 48 hours, who you can communicate with via messaging, phone call, or video chat. Let BetterHelp connect you to a therapist who can support you, all from the comfort of your own home. Click on the link in the description and enjoy a special discount on your first month. Now there's no questioning Jon Jones's accomplishments in the octagon. At the peak of his powers and the height of his activity, you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who didn't think Jon was the pound-for-pound #1 and greatest of all time. Aside from his disqualification for a 12-6 elbow back in 2009, Jones has never lost. And all of Jon's opponents haven't been low-level either. In fact, quite the opposite. 8 of his victories have been against former UFC champions, whereas Islam has just 2, finishing Shogun Rua, Rampage Jackson, Lyoto Machida, Vitor Belfort, Daniel Cormier, and more. And in 2023, John returned after a 3-year layoff to win the heavyweight title and become one of the few UFC fighters to win belts in multiple divisions.
Well, on paper, he is the champion. On paper, he's the best light heavyweight we've ever seen. And on paper, he is the best pound-for-pound #1 fighter on the planet.
In fact, John has 15 wins in UFC title fights, the most in UFC history. And when it comes to longevity, John is unrivaled. He's exclusively competed in title fights since 2011. For context, Makhachev has just 16 fights total in the UFC. So with all of these accolades that quite clearly outweigh Makhachev's, why are so many people in uproar that Dana White thinks John should be pound for pound #1? Well, the most obvious point is John's inactivity. Whether it's been injuries, putting on some size for heavyweight, or outside the octagon controversies, we just haven't seen Jones compete all that much in recent time. Since his last light heavyweight fight, Jones fought only once in over 4 years.
That was March of last year. Oh my goodness, John Jones won the heavyweight championship in March of last year. I didn't realize that. I did not realize that. And he'd sat for 3 years going into that. Wow, so one time in 4 years, John dipped his toe in the pool.
Makhachev has 8 victories in that same time span. But aside from blitzing through Cyril Gane, which was a great stylistic matchup for him considering how Francis Ngannou out-wrestled Gane, Jones really struggled with his last few opponents at 205. Many people believed Dominic Reyes did enough to beat John at UFC 247, and he could only manage a split decision with Thiago Santos, despite Santos tearing his ACL in the second round.
Watch back Thiago Santos versus John Jones and watch back Dominic Reyes versus John Jones and tell me who you think got more done against John Jones, because having called both of those fights, I felt like Thiago Santos beat John Jones.
And while Reyes and Santos are high-level fighters, they both went on to be defeated much more comfortably than John Jones was able to. Another question mark around Jones currently is his insistence on fighting Stipe instead of the interim heavyweight champion Tom Aspinall.
You're a skeptic. You would say that he's trying to duck Tom Aspinall. I know he's not doing that, but that's what it looks like.
Perhaps 3 years ago, the Stipe fight would have been huge, but the hype has died for most MMA fans now that we've been waiting for so long. Stipe will be 42 and without a win in 4 years when the matchup does eventually happen. And it feels like most fans would much rather John take on a young, talented heavyweight in the prime of his career rather than an aging legend. So all that said, is the door open for Islam Makhachev to be pound for pound #1, no questions asked? Coming off his title defense against Dustin, it's time to start thinking about Makhachev as a potential all-time great. He has the 3rd longest winning streak in UFC history at 14 victories, above the likes of George St. Pierre, Demetrius Johnson, Khabib, and so many more who we talk about in the GOAT conversation. Only Anderson Silva and Kamaru Usman sit above him, but he's just 2 fights away from tying the all-time record. And Islam's accomplished this in arguably the most talent-stacked division in the entire sport. He ended Charles Oliveira's 11-fight win streak in comfortable fashion, stopped Volkanovski's 12-fight run, and then knocked him out in the rematch to silence any doubters about how close their first fight was.
Islam talked a lot about coming in and revenging, and setting the record straight on how everybody felt about the last fight.
And even though Volk was the one moving up in weight, he was the pound for pound #1 at the time, and Makhachev put his lights out. Islam's naysayers tend to highlight his knockout loss as a reason against him being pound for pound #1, but that lone defeat was all the way back in 2015. Since then, Islam's been pretty much untouchable in most of his fights. Guys like Dan Hooker or Bobby Green weren't able to even lay a glove on him, and Islam isn't just taking his opponents down with his superior wrestling and holding them there, but he's looking to stop them at all times.
Because of his strength and his control and the way that he manipulated you on the ground, I think Makhachev possesses a lot of those same type of qualities. Very similar when he gets you on the ground. But because he's a better striker, I feel he's even more dangerous than Habib was during his prime.
He has finished 7 of his last 8 opponents, and whether it's submissions, knockouts on the feet, or ground and pound, Islam can win in any way possible. And the fact that the majority of MMA fans are giving Dustin a lot of credit for making the fight competitive is just testament to how dominant Makhachev is. Dustin is the former interim champion, a legend of the sport, and has been on the pound-for-pound rankings himself not too long ago. Yet making a fight competitive was seen as almost a moral victory for someone of that caliber.
Man, he was able to really damage and hurt a guy like Islam Makhachev. If this guy is considered the pound-for-pound best fighter in the world, I mean, look at what the number 3 lightweight in the world just did to him. Yeah, granted, Islam did finish him at the very end.
That's how good Islam is. We expect him to go out there and dominate the best guys in the world with ease. But the big question is, who truly deserves that pound-for-pound number 1 spot, Islam Makhachev or Jon Jones? After going through both men's accomplishments, there's a case to be made for either fighter. And it looks like the MMA community can't make their minds up.
Well, he took some time away from
He
the
beat 3
sport.
generations of fighters.
He beat 3 generations of fighters, and they were like, well, that was a long time ago. I'm like, granted, but he's still active. And they were like, no, he's not. And I said, well, he is. He took some time away, granted, because there was contractual negotiations, politics, stuff going on behind the scenes. Now he's got a tremendous deal. He came back, he beat Cyril Gane. And people say, well, he was a tailor-made matchup. He was also the interim heavyweight champion at the time, I think. He was the number 1 guy. It's not his fault that he was the top guy. He beat him. He was scheduled to fight Stipe, tore his pec, and injuries happen. Look at McGregor.
Islam deserves a ton of credit, and in my opinion, is the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world. He has come a long way as well, and now he has the 3rd longest winning streak in UFC history. That's 14 in a row in one of the best weight classes in the UFC in its prime right now.
Dana White in the pound-for-pound list saying that Jon Jones is pound-for-pound over Islam. But for me, I agree. I think if we're talking pound-for-pound, I mean, everyone's criteria is different, but I think pound for pound would mean, the way I understand it is, if weight was not a factor, size wasn't a factor, skill for skill, who would be the best guy? And I agree, I think it's Jon Jones.
One observation is that a lot of the people who are siding with Jones are doing so based on legacy, not current form.
Remember, the pound for pound discussion is not a legacy discussion. We're not talking about greatest of all time. That's a totally different discussion. Pound for pound discussion right now is who's the best right now? Who's the baddest man in the world right now? If everything was equal and everyone was fighting at the same weight. If you could boil everyone down to one weight, let's say it's 185 or 170, who's got the best skills? Who's the man? That's what it is. It's not greatest of all time.
Even Dana's original comments are mistaking the meaning of pound for pound. He claimed if you lock any fighter in the world in a room with Jon Jones and only one walks out, it's going to be Jon.
The greatest fighter to ever live, ever, is fucking Jon Jones. When you look at, Jon Jones has never lost a fight.
UFC and boxing, or just UFC?
Ever.
Wow.
Because when you really think about fighting, put 2 guys in a room and who fucking comes out? Jon Jones walks out of that fucking room every time.
While that is true in almost all circumstances, that's not what being the pound for pound number 1 means in most people's eyes. Otherwise, the heavyweight champion would almost always be pound for pound number 1. The pound for pound rankings is a fictional list that says, if every fighter on the roster was the exact same weight, skill for skill, who'd be number 1?
Pound for pound is a hypothetical. That's a hypothetical ranking. I don't think people understand that. That's hypothetical. That means
So true.
that means pound for pound. It doesn't matter what weight class I put you in. Your style, the way that you fight, can transcend whether you're a bantamweight, a flyweight, or whether you're a heavyweight. That's all that means. It just says that your style, the way that you fight, will definitely translate, and you can be victorious and successful in those weight classes.
But what people take into consideration is going to be slightly different for everyone. How far back on their records do we look? Does their level of recent opposition matter? And is it just, who do we think would win a fantasy fight between the two at the same weight? If it's recent fights, Islam takes it, no questions asked. But if it's your body of work over a long period, John's level of opposition speaks for itself.
By the way, if you look at their career records, 26-1, 27-1. Now, obviously, we know Jones's one is a little bit suspect, but whatever. They have very similar career records. But if you look within what I do with my rankings, is I look at the last 3 years and put the most emphasis on the last 3 years. And if you look at the run that Islam has been on versus John Jones just has the one against Cyril Gane, that to me is you give Islam the nod for right now for the work, the volume of his work, the quality of his work. And so I have Islam number one pound for pound right now, but I still believe John Jones is the greatest of all time.
And that tends to be the general sentiment. If we're having a conversation about greatest of all time, then of course John is right at the top of that list.
Let's talk about activity. 3 years off. Nobody, not even Ali, nobody's ever come from 3 years off and looked the same. John Jones walked through the number one guy in the heavyweight division like it was nothing with 3 years off. Yeah, John Jones is the best ever. Ever. And when I say ever, I mean in any combat sport. He's the best ever. You throw John Jones in a room with anybody, John Jones walks out of the room.
But being the pound-for-pound number one fighter right now is a different story. So unless we can all agree on a clear definition for what pound-for-pound means, this debate is sure to rage on. And while there might be a debate about who deserves the number one spot, another unexpected conflict is unfolding between Jorge Masvidal and Chael Sonnen. So check out my full breakdown to understand what's going on between them and why they've decided to go at each other now.